Hey folks, J.D. Payne here. Continuing in the series related to my book, Apostolic Imagination, and in this episode, I want to talk about the issue of reimagining the West. So, for decades now, the traditionally Western countries have heard the expression, the West as a mission field. The church in those countries, Australia, New Zealand, traditionally Western European countries, United States, Canada, if you will, have been using this expression for some time. Now, I'm speaking particularly from my U.S. Context. It was in 1998, really, when this concept picked up a lot of steam, and that was with the publication of Darrell Guter's book, Missional Church. The Gospel in Our Culture Network had been influenced heavily by the work of Leslie Newbigin. Of course, many of the conversations were happening in Western Europe, and they eventually migrated over to the North American context. And then by the late 90s, you have many groups within the United States beginning to talk about this concept with a great passion, that concept being the West as a mission field. In fact, it was Newbigin who was asking the question during his day, what would a genuine missionary encounter look like within the Western world? Now, I want to spend some time talking a little bit about where we are at the present. So there's a great deal of history that's there, and I'm not going to go into that in this video. But I want to just kind of put some things out there on the table that I think are critical for moving forward in the days to come. Now, in order to do that, I have to make a disclaimer. Here's the disclaimer: the greatest needs for the gospel, the greatest needs for apostolic work, the greatest needs for seeing churches planted, and the greatest physical needs are outside of the traditionally Western countries. So outside of the Western world that I'm talking about. So I want you to hear that, because that should be that should be a priority for the church in the world. In other words, the greatest needs are found in majority world context. So, having said that, let's think about the West and maybe even reimagine some of the things that we're dealing with right now. So, if the West is a mission field, we have to acknowledge that it is not like the traditional understanding of what we have called the mission field in 200 years of Protestant missionary work. In other words, it is different. It looks different. It's significantly different on many levels. And so I want to help you think through some things. And the first thing I want you to think about is that where we find a great challenge today in the West, when we think about engaging the West with the gospel, is that we find ourselves in a geographical context where there are churches, where there is substantial church structures and organization, where there is a great deal of what I refer to as pastoral hegemony. Now, please understand, in my calling, that is where I have been. I've served as a pastor for 19 years. So don't hear me knocking pastors when I say this. But the reality is that in the Western world, for the most part, definitely within the United States, we filter all ministry, all strategy, all methods through really a pastoral set of glasses. And so the pastoral mindset, the pastoral imagination guides and provides the channel in which ministry flows. Now, that is wonderful and that is important when the church is well established, when the church structures are strong and in place. But what happens if there are cultural shifts that occur within a context whereby you now begin to see large numbers of unreached people groups having migrated from majority world countries into Western countries throughout the world? Several years ago, I wrote a book called Strangers Next Door, which was basically a study of the migration of unreached people groups into the traditionally Western countries. And so how then does the church respond when we find ourselves in a situation that not only has strong church structures in place, but unreached people groups living next door at the same time? Cultural shifts are happening. So you're also beginning to see these cultural shifts occur whereby people are now choosing to follow no religious preference whatsoever. In the U.S., we talk about the rise of the nones, the N-O-N-E-S, those that are shifting away from any sort of religious claims whatsoever in their lives. So you've got these worldview shifts that are happening. You've got migration that's happening. By the way, the United States is home to the third largest number of unreached people groups in the world. And Canada is home to the sixth largest number of unreached people groups in the world. So having said that, you've got these religious shifts, you've got these cultural shifts, you've got these migratory shifts that are happening. How then does the church respond? The way that the church so often responds in those contexts is through a pastoral approach to ministry. And again, that's wonderful when you're in an area whereby there is an established church presence, there is an established church authority that's well respected, whereby the cultural gaps between believers and the unbelievers are not as great. But where you have those great cultural gaps, the need for an apostolic approach is vital and is critical. What is a challenge when it comes to moving forward? The challenge is, how will the church in the West engage in apostolic work whereby there are strong pastoral structures already in the same geography? And that is a significant challenge for us today. Another thing that we need to think about when it comes to the work of the church in the world, and particularly in the issue of related to the West, is we have to ask the question about where is our heart? In other words, where do we find our passions? And so often, all we have to do is look at how we use our resources. Now, I won't go into all the details. I put these in the book. Other scholars have written about these matters as well. But the reality is that a very, very small portion of every dollar, it's only like about a penny or something of that nature, is actually going toward unreached people groups. So that every dollar that we put in our offering plate, so to speak, the overwhelming majority is going to establish church ministry among reached people. When we talk about sending, now not just in the West, but all throughout the world, when we talk about sending missionaries, if I can use the classic language just for the sake of time, for every 30 people that are sent throughout the world, only one person goes to serve among the unreached people groups. So the question of where is our hearts is a significant issue. Another thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind when we think about the West in the present and the West in days to come is the need for pastors to be trained to think apostolically. Pastors need to be taught how to develop an apostolic imagination. Pastors do not need to function in apostolic roles. They don't need to basically resign from their ministries and engage in apostolic teams, but they need to remain in their calling. They need to remain who they are. They need to equip the saints. They need to raise up the apostolic teams to commission and see them sent out. And in order to do that, there needs to be a shift that occurs in the way that they view ministry, in the way that they view the people that they serve, and in the way they view the world around them. And for the most part, seminaries, Bible colleges, the cultural context in which we find ourselves, for the most part, we're not training pastors to develop an apostolic imagination. We're training them to have a pastoral imagination, rightly so, but that imagination, again, leads us to only see the world through a pastoral set of lenses, and the West demands a shift at this moment in time. The other thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind, and I'll kind of will leave it at this, and that is the issue of partnership development with majority world churches. Now, a lot of missiologists are talking about this. A lot of mission agencies are talking about this. More and more books are being written on this topic. And so I just want to leave this with you, and I want you to just begin to think about, what does this look like in your context? And here it is. For 200 years of Protestant missionary work, we could go back even farther in other labors, but for 200 years in the Protestant missionary movement, we have to confess, we have to admit, a great deal of colonialism and paternalism were connected to what we did. There's a history there that is an unhealthy history in many different levels. We have to acknowledge that, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the Lord has given the church in the West a great deal of experience. The Lord has given the church in the West a great deal of resources, and so we also still have the Great Commission applied to who we are as well. So we must engage in the global task. But the question is, what will partnerships look like moving forward? How can we in the West truly have partnerships with people and not paternalism? How can we come to the table as a team? How can we collaborate together? How can we work with one another and co-labor as servants of the Lord with one another, from brothers and sisters in the West, with brothers and sisters throughout majority world context? And that is going to be a significant learning experience for all, but one that we absolutely must learn from, and one we must engage in, and one we must be understanding and patient with one another in this process. Hey, don't forget to leave a comment below. I certainly would appreciate hearing your thoughts on this important topic of reimagining the West. And don't forget to strike like, and don't hide, but subscribe and show you care. Share. See ya.